On the night Elvis met the Beatles in 1965, everyone expected smiles, handshakes, and a harmless photo. But inside that small Bel Air living room, something happened that none of them saw coming. Something big enough to shake the biggest stars on Earth and leave them staring in stunned silence. It was August 27, 1965, and Bel Air felt like it was holding its breath. The heat from the day still clung to the streets, making the night air thick and warm. At 565 Perugia Way, soft yellow lights glowed behind tall hedges, marking the house where Elvis Presley was waiting. Inside, the living room was quiet except for the low buzz of a television and the steady hum of cicadas outside. The place smelled faintly of leather jackets, fresh polish on the wooden floors, and the powdered sugar from the donuts someone had brought hours earlier but no one touched. Joe Esposito walked across the room for the 5th time, rubbing his hands together. Jerry Schilling leaned on the doorway, trying to look relaxed, but his eyes kept darting toward the front windows. Marty Lacker checked his wristwatch over and over, like each second carried its own weight. Even the walls felt tight with anticipation. Tonight wasn't just another meeting. Tonight, the Beatles were coming. Elvis sat on the couch, guitar resting across his lap. The TV flickered blue light across his face, but he wasn't really watching. His foot tapped lightly against the floor, keeping rhythm with a tune he hadn't played out loud yet. On the surface, he looked calm, the king always in control. But inside, he felt the same nerves his friends felt. Maybe even more. Everyone expected Elvis to be fearless, but he wasn't. Not tonight. Not when 4 young men who had taken over the world were about to step into his living room. What if they didn't like him? What if they felt disappointed? What if this meeting became one more awkward memory instead of something meaningful? Even legends wonder if they still matter. Think they'll be early? Jerry asked quietly. Joe shrugged. Superstars don't run on clocks. A laugh should have followed, but none came. The cicadas outside suddenly stopped buzzing. That silence felt strange, almost too perfect. Then headlights swept across the curtains. A slow-moving car engine rumbled up the driveway. Elvis stopped tapping his foot. Joe froze mid-step. Marty moved toward the window, lifting the curtain just an inch. A long black limousine rolled to a stop near the gate. For a moment, no one breathed. The world outside seemed to pause. There are moments in life when time feels heavier, as if something important is forming in the air. Have you ever felt that? The quiet before something huge, even when you don't know what it is. It's a feeling that crawls under your skin and stays there. The gates opened. The limousine door clicked. Soft footsteps touched the pavement. A faint laugh drifted through the warm night, carried by the slight breeze. The Beatles had arrived. And inside that living room, none of them had any idea how fast one unexpected sentence would change everything that followed. The front door opened slowly, and warm night air slipped into the living room. Joe stepped forward first, then froze when he saw them. John, Paul, George, and Ringo stood in the doorway like 4 schoolboys walking into a surprise exam. Their famous black suits looked sharp under the hallway lights, but their eyes gave away everything. They were nervous, more nervous than anyone expected. Ringo whispered, "What if he doesn't like us?" Paul nudged him gently. "He invited us, mate." But even he didn't look sure. Behind them, Brian Epstein nodded politely at Elvis's men, trying to smooth the moment like a host at a tense dinner party. His voice sounded calm, but he kept adjusting his cufflinks. Even he felt the pressure. Inside the living room, Elvis didn't stand. He stayed seated on the couch, guitar still on his lap, TV still flickering. It wasn't disrespect. It was fear wrapped in coolness. A strange attempt to look relaxed while every muscle in his body tightened. He wanted to greet them like equals, not idols. But the room didn't know how to read it. The Beatles stepped in carefully, almost tiptoeing across the rug. The room felt smaller with them inside. 2 worlds colliding in one ordinary space. The air thickened. Even the cicadas outside seemed to pause again, as if trying to listen. Jerry cleared his throat. "Elvis, they're here." Elvis nodded but didn't look up right away. He plucked a soft note on his guitar instead. It echoed just enough to make everyone's shoulders tense. Finally, he lifted his eyes. For a moment, nothing moved. Elvis stared at them. The Beatles stared back. For young men trying not to look starstruck. One older star trying not to look overwhelmed. Human nerves wrapped inside famous faces. Paul tried to smile. Came out crooked. George shifted his weight like he was standing on a stage without a guitar. Ringo folded his hands behind his back. John raised his chin a bit too high, trying to mask his own fear with attitude. People think legends always feel strong. But what happens when legends meet their own legends? What happens when admiration flows both ways, and nobody knows how to handle it? A quiet tension spread across the room like a slow-moving shadow. Joe felt it. Jerry felt it. Elvis felt it most. And then something simple, something tiny, pushed the tension even higher. Elvis still didn't stand up. The Beatles exchanged puzzled glances, unsure what it meant. And that single silent choice created the first crack in the night. The Beatles stepped fully into the room, expecting Elvis to say something first. A greeting, a joke, a simple nice to meet you. But instead, the room fell into a strange silence that felt heavier with every passing second. Elvis kept his eyes on the guitar strings, brushing them softly, as if pretending nothing unusual was happening. John Lennon later called it the strangest quiet I'd ever walked into. And tonight, that quiet felt sharp enough to cut through the air. Paul stood closest to Elvis, shifting his weight from foot to foot. His hands kept brushing his suit jacket, trying to look relaxed even though his heartbeat thudded like a drum inside his chest. George stared at the patterned rug, tracing the shapes with his eyes. Ringo blinked slowly, too many times, like he couldn't decide where to look. Elvis still didn't speak. The guitar's low strum echoed through the room like a heartbeat in a cave. It bounced off the walls, making the silence even louder. Joe glanced at Jerry as if asking, "Should we say something?" But neither moved. No one wanted to interrupt the clash of two worlds happening silently in front of them. Elvis finally lifted his head and looked at the four young men standing stiffly in a line. His voice came out calm, almost too calm. "Well, if you just gonna stand there," he said, "I'm gonna go to bed." The words dropped into the room like a stone into water. Shock, confusion, and then laughter. But the laughter wasn't natural. It burst out too fast, too loud, almost desperate. The Beatles laughed because they didn't know what else to do. Elvis's men laughed because they hoped it would break the tension. Even Elvis chuckled a little, but his smile flickered for a moment, revealing the nerves beneath. What makes powerful people feel small sometimes? Why does a moment with someone we admire twist our confidence into knots? The laughter faded, leaving behind the same fragile air. But something had changed. Walls were shifting. The tension wasn't gone. It was moving, waiting for the next spark. George finally looked up and whispered to Paul, "Is this really happening?" Paul nodded, though he wasn't sure of anything anymore. John stepped forward, adjusting his glasses with a slight smirk. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the quiet, the awkward smiles, the legends pretending not to tremble. And then he opened his mouth. A bold line formed on his tongue. Reckless, risky, the kind that could flip the whole night in one heartbeat. He said it, and everything changed. John Lennon took one small step toward Elvis, hands in his pockets, chin tilted just enough to mask the nerves eating at him. The room watched him like he was approaching a sleeping lion. John swallowed, cleared his throat, and said with a crooked grin, "We came to jam, unless the king's retired." The words hit the room like a spark hitting dry grass. Joe's eyebrows shot up. Jerry almost choked on air. Paul's eyes widened. Ringo whispered, "John, mate." Under his breath, even George stiffened, unsure whether John had just saved them or sunk them. Elvis stopped strumming. His fingers froze on the strings. His foot stopped tapping. His eyes lifted slowly, meeting John's with a steady, unreadable stare. For a second, the tension snapped tight enough to hold the whole room in place. Then Elvis's mouth curved into a grin. It wasn't a small grin. It wasn't polite. It was wide, warm, and real, the kind that could melt a frozen moment in half a heartbeat. The entire room exhaled at once. Even John's shoulders loosened slightly. "So that's how it is?" Elvis said, voice smooth. John shrugged. "Only if you're up for it." Elvis stood for the first time that night. The Beatles straightened instinctively, like soldiers saluting a general. Elvis walked over to a corner where a bass rested against an amp. He held it out toward John, who blinked in surprise. "Try this one," Elvis said. "She's a good girl." John accepted the bass with both hands, suddenly respectful. Paul smiled awkwardly as Elvis motioned him toward the piano. George received one of Elvis's polished guitars, running his fingers along the neck like he was touching history. Ringo moved toward a drum kit still smelling of Elvis's last recording session. Wood, dust, and old rhythm. Two worlds were officially mixing. The room shifted from awkward silence to crackling energy. The air buzzed with possibility. It felt like the start of something rare, something unbelievable. A moment fans would dream about for decades. Humor had opened the door. Courage had stepped through it. Can humor fix what fear creates? Can one bold line turn strangers into equals? John plucked a low note, testing the bass. Paul tapped a few keys. George tuned his guitar carefully. Ringo twirled a drumstick between his fingers, ready but unsure. Elvis watched them, arms crossed, the warmth still on his face. For the first time all night, he looked excited. But the first thing that connected them wasn't music. It was something far more human, and it came before the first chord. Before anyone played a single note, Paul McCartney cleared his throat. His fingers hovered above the piano keys, but he didn't press down. Instead, he glanced at Elvis with an uneasy smile. "Before we start," he said softly, "I should probably confess something." The room stilled again. John paused mid-pluck. George looked up from tuning the guitar Elvis had handed him. Ringo lowered his drumsticks. Even Elvis raised an eyebrow, curious. Paul rubbed his neck awkwardly. We all copied you. At some point." He laughed nervously. "The moves, the stance, even the little lip thing." He half demonstrated it, cheeks reddening. For a heartbeat, no one reacted. Then Elvis let out a deep, warm laugh. A real laugh, full in his chest. He bent forward slightly, hand on his knee, shaking his head like he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. The laughter spread. John smirked. Ringo chuckled. George finally exhaled. The confession cracked something open. Not tension this time, but connection. Honesty can do that. One simple truth can knock down walls thicker than fame, thicker than fear. In that moment, the King and the Fab Four weren't rivals, icons, or headlines. They were just men telling the truth in a quiet room. Elvis straightened, wiping the corner of his eye. "I figured as much," he said with a grin. "You boys took my tricks and made 'em better." "No chance," Paul replied, smiling wider now. John added, "We stole the tricks, sure. But you're the magician." Elvis pointed at him. "You're trouble, Lennon." John shrugged. "Always have been." The room filled with soft laughter again. Not forced this time, but natural, easy. Something invisible shifted. The nervousness that had clung to the night began to drift away, replaced by a kind of warmth that only honesty can spark. George leaned toward Marty Lacker, whispering, "I can't believe this is real." Marty smiled back, whispering, "Neither can we. Isn't it strange how honesty can build bridges in seconds? Why do we hide the truths that could bring us closer?" Elvis rolled his shoulders, loosening up. For the first time all night, he looked completely relaxed. The Beatles mirrored him, their stiff postures softening as the room breathed easier. The living room no longer felt like a meeting of giants. It felt like the start of a friendship. Elvis lifted his guitar again, fingers settling naturally on the frets. The Beatles watched him closely, waiting. He struck the first chord. Everything changed. They started with "I Feel Fine." Elvis nodded at Paul to begin, and the opening riff rolled across the living room like a spark catching dry leaves. Paul grinned as Elvis picked up the bass, plucking the line with surprising ease. John leaned in closer, laughing at the sight of the king playing a Beatles hit. Ringo tapped the beat gently on the drum rims, letting the rhythm settle before giving it full strength. George listened, eyes half closed, adjusting tiny details until the room felt alive. For the first time that night, everyone forgot to be nervous. Music does that. It slips under the skin and pushes fear aside. It makes strangers feel like family. Inside that small Bel Air house, fame lost its weight. The world outside faded completely. All that remained were 5 men and a shared love for sound. Elvis shifted to a new groove, a bluesy riff he had never recorded. It rolled smooth and warm, like something born on a Memphis sidewalk. Ringo's face lit up instantly. George leaned forward, copying the rhythm with delicate precision. Paul looked stunned. "Why haven't you released that?" he asked. Elvis shrugged. "Just playing around." John added a sharp, playful chord, giving the groove a bite. Elvis matched him instantly, raising the energy. The room brightened without any change in the lamps. Even the cicadas outside joined softly, buzzing like tiny backup singers. Joe Esposito watched from the hallway, whispering, "No one's gonna believe this." Jerry Schilling nodded slowly, eyes wide. "Feels like we're watching history sneak in the back door." A roadie peeked in through a cracked door, eyes glossy. Moments like this were rare, sacred, almost unreal. Isn't it strange how the biggest miracles often appear quietly? Do we ever understand the value of a moment while it's happening? For nearly 20 minutes, the jam kept growing. Elvis switched rhythms effortlessly. The Beatles followed with the excitement of kids discovering a new game. Laughter burst out between mistakes. Short bursts of harmony formed and shattered. Pure joy held the room together, weaving an invisible thread from Elvis's guitar to the Beatles' hands. Then Elvis paused suddenly. No warning. No que. He set his guitar down gently, as if preparing for something heavy. John's fingers froze on the strings. Paul looked confused. George stared at Elvis's hands. Ringo lowered his stick slowly, the room falling into stillness. Elvis stepped forward, eyes distant, almost searching. The warm energy that had filled the house cooled a little, replaced by a quiet tension none of them understood. Something shifted in his expression, a seriousness that hadn't appeared all night. None of them breathed. Even the cicadas outside fell silent, as if the night itself sensed what was coming. Elvis took a deep breath. "Boys," he said softly, "can I ask you something?" Time leaned in. Then Elvis asked the question that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Elvis stood there, eyes lowered, fingers loosely interlocked in front of him. The energy that had filled the room only minutes earlier had drained into something quieter, something heavier. The Beatles waited, unsure whether to sit, stand, or speak. Even John, who never ran out of words, stayed perfectly still. Elvis finally lifted his eyes. "How long do you boys think this will last?" The question didn't hit like a punch. It hit like an echo, slow, deep, and unsettling. John blinked. Paul swallowed. George shifted uncomfortably. Ringo looked down at his shoes, tapping one toe against the carpet. The jam session glow faded just a little. Elvis wasn't talking about the evening. He was talking about everything. Fame, pressure, worship, expectations, the crowds that screamed too loudly, and the emptiness that followed them home afterward. Paul spoke first. We try not to think about that." Elvis nodded. "I've tried that too." His tone wasn't dark, just honest. The kind of honesty that only slips out when music has softened the walls between strangers. George stepped closer, voice quiet. "Do you feel it changing?" Elvis didn't answer right away. He walked toward the window, looking out at the still night beyond the gates of Perugia Way. "Some days I do, some days I don't, but the question stays." John exhaled slowly. "You're Elvis Presley. You'll be here forever." Elvis smiled faintly. "Forever's a long time, Lennon." Silence returned, but it wasn't the awkward silence from earlier. This one felt thoughtful, almost sacred. 5 men who had conquered the world were suddenly afraid of the same invisible thing. Time. Ringo broke the silence gently. Maybe everything ends, yeah. But maybe that makes it matter more. Elvis turned, studying their faces carefully. The Beatles were still young, still rising, still hopeful. But in that moment they felt the weight he carried. Pressure can be a shadow even behind the brightest spotlight. Joe Esposito watched from the corner, feeling the shift too. Later he would say that the room grew smaller, as if the truth itself had squeezed inside. To lighten the moment, Elvis walked to a shelf and picked up a small box. "Got something for you boys." Inside were 4 custom belt buckles, shining metal, each engraved with a simple lightning bolt. He handed them out with a grin that restored some warmth to the room. Paul held his buckle like a treasure. "These are unbelievable," George whispered. "I'm never losing this." In return, John placed a small reel-to-reel tape on Elvis's table. "A gift," he said. "A little something we've been messing with." Elvis lifted it gently, like it was fragile gold. That tape would disappear within a year. No one knows where it went. But people close to Elvis swear it existed. A silent witness to a night the world wasn't supposed to hear.
Moments fada.
Objects vanish. But echoes? Echoes stay. And the echo of that question would follow each of them for the rest of their lives. The house felt different after the question. Something gentle, something human had settled into the room. The jam session was over, but the connection it created remained, hovering like soft smoke above the warm lamps. Elvis walked back toward the couch and sat down slowly, the weight of his own thoughts still lingering behind his eyes. The Beatles followed, taking seats wherever they found space. For the first time all night, it didn't feel like the King and the Fab Four. It felt like 5 men who finally understood each other. Elvis leaned back, letting out a long breath. "You know," he said softly, "nobody prepares you for any of this. The crowds, the cameras, the feeling that you're supposed to be someone bigger than you feel." His voice carried no bitterness, only truth, a gentle kind of honesty that felt rare, even in a room full of people who lived their lives in the spotlight. Paul rubbed his palms together slowly, thinking, "We get scared too. Sometimes we look at each other and wonder how long we can keep this going without losing ourselves." His voice cracked slightly, so he cleared his throat and tried to steady it. "People think we're stronger than we are." John added, "Sometimes I can't tell if the crowds love us or love the idea of us." He wasn't being dramatic. He said it like a man stating the weather. Straight, simple, real. Elvis nodded. "That's the part they never see." He glanced toward the window, where the curtains shifted gently with the night breeze. "They see the sparkle, not the struggle." For a moment, everyone fell quiet again. But this silence felt warm, not sharp. The kind of silence where people listen. The kind where nobody has to pretend. George leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Maybe that's why tonight matters. Nobody here is pretending." He looked around the room, almost shyly. "Feels rare." Elvis smiled. "Rare is right. There are moments in life that don't need applause to matter. Moments when truth sits between people like a steady flame, lighting things that were hidden before." Inside that living room, a truth had revealed itself. Behind the noise, behind the fame, behind the legends, they were all human beings trying to stay whole. "Funny," Ringo said softly. "We all came here thinking you were the untouchable one." Elvis raised an eyebrow. "Me? You?" Ringo repeated with a small grin. "Turns out you're human." Elvis laughed. A soft, grateful sound that loosened the air. "Thank God for that," he said. They talked for a while longer. Quietly, honestly. No cameras. No crowd. No managers whispering about schedules. Just 5 men sharing fears, hopes, mistakes, and the strange pull of fame. Elvis told them about nights he felt lonely even with thousands screaming his name. John admitted he sometimes feared the group was moving faster than they could handle. Paul shared how responsibility kept him awake at night. George mentioned that he prayed more now, trying to stay grounded. Ringo said he still felt like the lucky one, but sometimes that scared him too. What would we become if we let our heroes see our truth? And what truths do we hide, even from ourselves? As the night grew later, Elvis stood again and walked toward the hallway. He came back holding a scarf, a simple, light-colored piece of fabric he kept from a past concert. "Here," he said, handing it to Paul. "For luck." Paul held it gently, almost reverently, knowing it meant more than just cloth. Elvis then walked to the wall and pulled down a small framed photo, a candid one of him laughing backstage years earlier. He handed it to John. "Don't lose that," he said. John nodded solemnly, touched more than he expected. George asked if he could take one of the guitar picks Elvis had used earlier. Elvis handed him 3. Ringo asked for nothing, but Elvis gave him something anyway. A small wooden bead from a necklace he'd worn during a show. "For rhythm," Elvis said. These weren't gifts. They were pieces of himself. Outside, the cicadas had returned to their steady hum. The air cooled. The night began to settle. And inside that quiet living room, something sacred had taken root. Something neither time nor rumor could erase. Moments like this don't ask for attention. They just stay inside people, echoing quietly through the years. That's what happened here. A night of honesty. A night of fear. A night of connection deeper than fame could fake. Greatness grows when admiration is shared, not hidden. Maybe that's what that room really meant. Some truths survive because they carry the weight of who we are. Some nights fade, but others follow us forever. If the story moved you, share it with someone who still believes in honest moments between legends. And tell us below, where were you the first time you heard Elvis or the Beatles? Your memory might carry a truth someone else needs to feel today.